Hi, and welcome to the class, What God Wants for Us. This is the third installment in our online teachings. Today we're going to look at a tool from Ignatian spirituality, a tool for discernment. Ignatius of Loyola was the creator of this tool known as the spiritual exercises and the rules for discernment. He was born in 1491 into a noble family in Spain, and he was one of 13 children. He lived in a time of knights and chivalry and kings and queens and princesses, and he was very much a product of his day. He dreamt of having great adventures as a knight, and he would fight battles and engage in duels for the privilege of representing a noble woman in battle. And in one of these battles, he was injured. He had a severe injury to his leg, from which he convalesced for a very long time. And it was during this convalescence that his life turned around, that he had an experience of a profound conversion to Christianity. He asked for books on knighthood and the adventures of knights while he was convalescing, but there were none available. And so instead he was given books on the life of Christ and on the lives of the saints. And as he read these and pondered them, he noticed within his heart and imaginations a burning desire to do good things and great things for Jesus. And so he pondered that some more and eventually experienced this deep conversion, which turned his life from a life of knighthood to a life of a religious order. It was only when he was 62 and at someone else's promptings that he wrote down the story of his conversion and what he learned from paying attention to his inner life and his inner feelings and imaginations during the time of his conversion. The spiritual exercises really arose from his own conversion experience. He became a spiritual director, or adept at the inner life and the movements of the Spirit in our lives. Now, in case you don't know what a spiritual director is, a spiritual director is kind of like a trail guide for the soul. It's someone who accompanies another person on the spiritual journey and who has experience and practice in the inner life and in the spiritual disciplines, someone who is attentive to the inner promptings of the Spirit and can accompany and help the other person avoid the pitfalls and also know where the places are to go for sustenance. Now, there is a lot more to cover in the spiritual exercises than we will get at in this particular tape. Simply put, what I would like to do is to look at the two fundamental orientations that Ignatius discusses in his rules for discernment and spiritual exercises that help us understand what God is doing in our lives. Ignatius identified two movements or two orientations, and they are consolations and desolations. And he understood that God was the one who worked those within us, that we on our own are not capable of willing those to happen. The orientations answer the basic questions. What is the overall focus of my heart and life at any given moment? And also, is that focus congruent with what God desires for my life in any given moment? In his rules for discernment, Ignatius understands these two fundamental orientations as being more than just feelings. They are an orientation of the heart, of the attitude, of our thoughts, of our imaginations, and also of our behaviors. The experience of consolation or desolation is the foundation of Ignatian discernment. When our inner life is at one with God, that is, when we are congruent with God's desires for our lives, then we experience a consolation, a feeling of peace or a feeling of joy, a sense that we are on the right road. Confidence. When our inner life is dissonant with God's desires for us, then we have a feeling of dissatisfaction or restlessness, or even a feeling of guilt or sadness. Always it is God who works these feelings within us. And that's an important thing to remember. We are not the creators of those feelings, of those consolations or desolations. And God uses them, however, to bring our heart and our mind and our behaviors into accord with God's deepest desire for our lives. Now, Ignatius sought God in all things. And as he examined his inner life, what he learned was that God was ever present, always there, and that God was all loving. And so his inner life drew him closer to God, and his outer life became an expression of that closeness. Ignatius was a master at using the movements of his inner life and his inner experiences to understand how God worked in his life. He noticed how long feelings of consolation lasted, and when they occurred, what he was doing in his thoughts and his feelings, and what he was doing in his exterior life as well. In his spiritual autobiography, he describes the interior movements that cause changes in our relationships as resulting from our encounter with God. So it is always God who prompts what happens in our lives, the changes that happen in our lives. And Ignatius is extremely honest, sharing his struggles, his pain, his desolation, as well as his joy and energies and consolation that result from personally encountering God. He noticed that feelings of desolations occurred when his thoughts and his imaginations and his desires began to drift towards thoughts of chivalry and of fighting for a particular noble woman. And when he fantasized about that, about winning battles for her, he noticed a growing dissatisfaction within himself. And he attributed that to God's working within his life. And when he thought of going barefoot in Jerusalem and following the paths of the great saints, of eating herbs and living an austere life and practicing spiritual disciplines, he began to notice a deeper consolation occurring within him that lasted far beyond the imaginations of his heart. And so he began to understand that these consolations and desolations were God's gentle promptings and nudges, helping him to go in one direction above the other. The thing I love about Ignatius is that he teaches us to have a discerning heart, and we can learn much from him. His method prompts us to look at the deeper movements in our own lives and in our own hearts, and to seek understanding of those movements and those feelings that often we just discount. The more we understand those feelings and movements, the clearer and freer our choices become as we choose to follow God and to move deeper into our relationship of intimacy with God. Now, his method presupposes three things, at least three things, but these are the three things I'd like to list for us tonight or today. One is that his method of discernment presupposes that we spend time in prayer on a daily basis, on a regular basis, that we already have this intimate relationship with God developing, that we have a regular practice of prayer. It also presupposes that our deepest desire is for God. And since I believe that is true for all of us, that as St. Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O God. I think that's true for all of us. Our deepest desire really is for God, although we camouflage it with many other desires. And then it presupposes that you and I have a healthy understanding of the presence of sin in our life and in the life of the world. About how sin often co-ops and corrupts our best thoughts and intentions for our lives and even our behaviors. To understand the presence of sin is to understand that God is God and we are not, and on our own we are helpless to overcome sin, but that God is always available to us and has finally overcome sin in the life of Jesus Christ. Now, this week, what I'm going to invite you to do is very simple, but it's not easy. I invite you to become aware of the consolations and desolations in your own life, of the times that you feel that you are drawing close to God, and the times that you feel God is far away, the times that you notice God, and the times that you maybe don't even have a thought about God. I've listed some consolations, some typical consolations, and some typical desolations on the printed material for this week. They're underneath, you'll find them underneath this video on our website. So I want you to ask yourself, where do you feel God moving in your life in the way of consolation? Where do you feel consolations from God? What are you doing when you feel them, and how long do they last? And then where do you feel or notice desolations, and what are you doing, and when do you notice those desolations? What are the outer circumstances of your life, and what are the inner movements? That's what we're looking for. This is a simple exercise, but it is so not an easy one, because our attention will be diverted from it time and time again. We have thousands of distractions from God every single day of our lives. So I invite you to be gentle with yourself, to give yourself some grace, as the kind of grace that God gives you. Be gentle, and every time you notice that you have drifted away from these thoughts of God, then just gently bring yourself back to thoughts of God and what God is doing in your life. None of us is going to do this perfectly. We are all beginners here. We are always beginners on the spiritual path. So I pray this week that the Spirit will guide you as you pay attention to the consolations and desolations in your life, that you will grow in a deepening awareness of how the Spirit subtly works for you, or maybe dramatically works in your life. I pray that we will all grow together in our awareness of God's presence. Blessings to you this week, and I will see you in class on Monday.